brothers and sisters, to our online worship service. We're excited about being back in person next week for Palm Sunday. On that day, we'll conclude our All Things New series connecting themes from Genesis 1 and 2 to Revelations 21 and 22 with the theme Tree of Life. Chip will be preaching next week for us. Today, we're going to look at the theme Son of Man, which is Jesus' favorite title for himself, found in Daniel chapter 7. And so we'll be in Daniel all day, that book, helping us connect Genesis to Revelation, knowing that Jesus meditated on the book of Daniel to remember who he was and why he was here. 78 times he uses the title, the Son of Man, of himself in Scripture. Out of those 78 times, 72 of them have direct references to Daniel. So if Jesus meditated that much about who he was from that book, we should too. And we're going to start today with Elisha reading a few verses, Daniel praising God for revealing to him not only the king's dream, but what it meant. So listen to Elisha as we begin.
Praise the name of God forever and ever, for he has all wisdom and power. He controls the course of world events. He removes kings and sets up other kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the scholars. He reveals deep and mysterious things and knows what lies hidden in darkness. Though he is surrounded by light, I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors, for you have given me wisdom and strength. You have told me what we asked of you and revealed to us what the king has demanded.
You are my morning soul. fills the night, it cannot hide the light. Whom shall I fear? You crush the enemies underneath my feet. You are my sword and shield, no troubles linger still. Whom shall I fear? I know who goes before me, I know who stands behind. The God of angel armies is always by my side. The one who reigns forever, he is a friend of mine. The God of angel armies is always by my side. My strength is in your name, for you alone can save. You will deliver me, yours is a victory. Whom shall I fear? Whom shall I fear? I know who goes before me, I know who stands behind. The God of angel armies is always by my side. The one who reigns forever, he is a friend of mine. The God of angel armies is always by my side. Nothing formed against me shall stand. You hold the whole world in your hands. I'm holding on to your promises. You are faithful. You are faithful. You are faithful. I know who goes before me, I know who stands behind. The God of angel armies is always by my side. The one who reigns forever, he is a friend of mine. The God of angel armies is always by my side. The God of angel armies is always by my side.
In the year 587 BC, the city of Jerusalem was attacked by the Babylonian Empire. And a year later, the city and the temple were plundered and burned.
Thousands of Israelites were taken from their homes and relocated all over ancient Babylon. They became exiles.
And so now they're a minority, surrounded by a new culture with new gods.
Now, some Israelites chose to resist Babylon by revolting or withdrawing. Others gave in, adopting the Babylonian way of life and accepting these new gods as their own.
And you might think those are your only two options, but the prophet Jeremiah told them to do something totally different and surprising. To settle in, build houses, plant gardens, grow families, and most surprisingly, to seek the well-being of Babylon and pray to the Lord on its behalf.
So this is like a third way.
Yeah, it's not compromise or revolt.
What does it look like?
Well, there's a whole book of the Bible that explores that question. It's the story of Daniel.
Daniel was one of the Israelites taken into the Babylonian exile.
And because Daniel had a royal heritage and education, he was recruited along with some friends to work in the high court of Babylon.
Work for the enemy? That would be compromise. Or they could gain the king's trust, take him down from the inside.
That's what you might expect, but instead, they take Jeremiah's advice and choose the third way. They serve the king of Babylon, taking on Babylonian names and even clothing style.
So they seek Babylon's well-being. But in doing so, aren't they just giving up their heritage?
It could seem that way, but actually they aren't. As you read on, the story focuses on moments where they draw the line, and they choose faithfulness to their God and resist the influence of Babylon.
So, for example,
Well, like when they're commanded to bow down to the idol of Babylon and give allegiance to the king as if he's a god.
they won't go that far.
Right, this is where you see their true loyalty. It requires them to critique Babylon's idolatry of power, its arrogance, its injustice, but they do it non-violently by laying down their lives. And so God vindicates Daniel and his friends for their faithfulness.
So they would serve Babylon, seek its well-being, but their loyalty was always to God.
Yeah, this is what Jeremiah was envisioning. The way of the exile is a combination of loyalty and also subversion.
So they're still exiles, but don't Daniel and his friends long to go home?
Yes, in fact, Daniel believed that God was going to send a ruler to bring down Babylon and create a true kingdom of peace.
When did he think this ruler would come?
Well, at first he thought within his lifetime, but then he had a dream where he found out that after Babylon would come another oppressive empire, then another, then another.
And so Babylon did fall, and Israel did get to go back home, but now they're ruled by Babylon's successors.
And so they maintained the mindset of an exile, waiting for their true home to come to them. And they continued the same practice of loyalty and subversion to any new versions of Babylon that came along. And this leads us to the time of Jesus.
The empire of his day was Rome, ruled by Caesar. Now, some Israelites wanted to resist, while others gave in and adopted Roman culture and its gods.
But watch Jesus carry on the subversive loyalty of Daniel. Like when he said, it's fine to pay taxes to Caesar, give him back his coins. But then he said, don't mistake Caesar for God. God's the one who deserves your total life and allegiance.
So the way of Jesus is this same mix of loyalty and subversion.
Yeah, like he taught his followers to love and even bless their enemies. But he also got arrested for speaking out against the corrupt leaders of Jerusalem and Rome. He critiqued their idolatry of power, and it cost him his life. But God vindicated him by raising him from the dead as the true king of the nations.
The king that Daniel had hoped for.
Right. And Jesus promised that one day his kingdom would prevail.
And so until then, his followers are living in a type of exile.
Yeah, this is why the Apostle Peter calls followers of Jesus foreigners and exiles. He told them to respect the authorities of whatever place you happen to live, to honor and love all people, but then he reminds them that this isn't their true home. They're still living in Babylon.
But, well, they're not living in Babylon. Babylon doesn't exist anymore.
Or does it? In the Bible, Babylon has become a symbol that describes any human institution that demands allegiance to its idolatrous redefinitions of good and evil.
Okay, so we all live and work in Babylon. How do I seek the well-being of Babylon while my allegiance is to someone greater?
Yes, Jesus' followers are called to live in that tension between loyalty and subversion. That's the way of the exile.
What love could remember, no wrongs we have done. Omniscient, all-knowing, becomes none. There's some thrown into a sea without bottom or shore. Our sins, they are many, His mercy is more. What patience would wait as we constantly roam? What father so tender is calling us home? He welcomes the weakest, the vilest, the poor. Our sins, they are many, His mercy is more. Praise the Lord, His mercy is more. Stronger than darkness, new every morn. Our sins, they are kindness he lavished on us. His blood was the payment, his life was the cost. We stood neath the debt we could never afford. Our sins, they are many, his mercy is more. Praise the Lord.
Announcements to be aware of. Tonight's Lenten service for our community will be at the Presbyterian Church at 6 o'clock. We are starting up high school youth group again 6:30 tomorrow night at Common Ground. And our home groups this week are going to make a decision based on the individual health of their home groups and their members. So be listening to your home group leaders for announcements and if you'll be meeting or when or where. Stephen ministry classes, the Christian care classes that give an overview what it would be like to be a Stephen minister, those will begin in April. We're excited about that new ministry. Blessed by this resource this week. It's called Son of Man, the Gospel of Daniel 7, a deep dive into understanding why Jesus used the Son of Man as the title that he referred to himself with 78 different times, and what he was doing when he tried to proclaim who he was. Everybody thought that he was human. They called him the Christ. They thought he was the God-anointed human who would come and set up a political revolution. But when Jesus says Son of Man, which actually means the human, he's claiming to be divine. And if that confuses you, hang on. You'll understand by the end of the message today. Son of Man is a clear claim to his divinity, and it all comes from Daniel chapter 7. To help us get there, we're going to look at a couple principles that will help us to be faithful in exile, will motivate us to have hope, to remain going upstream against the current of culture. Just like Daniel and his friends, who were the first wave of captives from Jerusalem, had this huge pressure to conform to the culture of Babylon, we do as well. And this story in chapter 2 and chapter 3 will set us up nicely to understand who Jesus is in Daniel chapter 7. Daniel 2 tells us the story of King Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man of the time, who had a rough night of sleep, had a dream he couldn't understand. He woke up grumpy. He calls all of his counselors in and says, "Tell me the dream and what it means, or I will cut you to pieces and destroy your houses." It's literally what he says. If you want to follow along in Daniel 2, you can see the danger of giving power to a man who thinks that his grumpiness and his mood has the right to just destroy life. And that's what we find here with Nebuchadnezzar. And they said, nobody can tell you what your dream was. If you tell us what the dream was, we can tell you what it meant. And he said, I know you're stalling. You're doomed. We're going to destroy you. And so he sends out his commander to gather up all of the counselors and the entire Babylonian empire and to execute them. Daniel and his three friends are in that number. And when Daniel hears about this decree, he asks the commander of the army, why is the king being so harsh? And he actually gets an audience with the king and very boldly asks for more time. His wisdom and discretion somehow convinced the king to give them one more day to figure out what the dream was and what it meant. And he goes to his friends, Daniel, and says, you guys, we need to pray that God will reveal this to us. That night, God did answer that prayer, and he reveals both the meaning and the dream itself to Daniel. He wakes up and shares this incredible song of praise that Elisha read to us at the beginning. We'll actually read again at the end, because this is what we need to know that will give us hope and to be faithful in the midst of exile. Praise the name of God forever and ever, for he has all wisdom and power. He controls the course of world events. He removes kings and sets up other kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the scholars. He reveals deep and mysterious things and knows what lies hidden in darkness, though he is surrounded by light. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors, for you have given me wisdom and strength. You have told me what we asked of you and revealed to us what the king commanded. And Daniel goes before the king and tells them that no one would be able to tell him what his dream was and what it meant unless God revealed it to him, and that God had revealed it to Daniel, and he wanted the king to know what was in his heart. He then tells him that the dream was of a statue that was set up, a statue that was a frightening sight, picking up in verse 32. The head of the statue was made of fine gold. Its chest and arms were silver. Its belly and thighs were bronze. Its leg were iron, and its feet were a combination of iron-baked clay. As he watched, a rock was cut from a mountain, but not by human hands. It struck the feet of iron and clay, smashing them to bits. The whole statue was crushed into small pieces of iron, clay, bronze, silver, and gold. And then the wind blew them away without a trace, like chaff on a threshing floor. But the rock that knocked the statue down became a great mountain that covered the whole earth. Daniel then proceeds to explain that this dream was about a succession of kingdoms. King Nebuchadnezzar, represented by the head at the top, and then inferior kingdoms after his, continuing down until this rock comes and crushes all of them. Described in verse 44. During the reigns of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed or conquered. It will crush all these kingdoms into nothingness, and it will stand forever. That is the meaning of the rock cut from the mountain, though not by human hands, that crushed to pieces the statue of iron, bronze, clay, silver, and gold. The great God was showing the king what will happen in the future. The dream is true, and its meaning is certain. Now you might be saying, how does this connect in our series from Genesis 1 to Revelation? Genesis 1, on the very first page of the story, we are introduced to this idea of a statue or an image. It's the word selim. Genesis 1:27 through 28 says, so God created humanity in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Now listen to Daniel's description of the head of gold of that statue as he's telling King Nebuchadnezzar what the dream meant. Your Majesty, you are the greatest of kings. The God of heaven has given you sovereignty, power, strength, and honor. He has made you the ruler over all the inhabited world and has put even the wild animals and the birds under your control. You are the head of gold. King Nebuchadnezzar embodied what had happened in empire, where human rule, which was originally given by God to partner with him to help the world flourish, help the goodness be for all. And that we were called to reflect God's authority and love for the world, but now empires that had risen had become kind of beastly. In other words, they were destroying people. They were taking over and destroying livelihood, and everything was for the service of the guy at top. This hierarchy that we see in Nebuchadnezzar, to the point where if he wakes up grumpy, people die. What this message was for Nebuchadnezzar is to realize the impermanence or the brevity of your empire. And this gold, silver, bronze, iron, clay, this kind of downgrade of quality of kingdoms that would deify themselves, getting back to the realization that every person is made in God's image. Everyone with value and infinite worth, not just the guy with the power at top. And we know that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we see this even in this story. But every human ruler, every king, every dictator is temporary. And we should not despair over or be enamored by any particular ruler or empire. In fact, the greatest mistake that we can make as God's people is to ground our trust and our identity in the kingdom in which we happen to live, because we are made for the kingdom that's represented by the rock. The rock not made by human hands destroys this idolatrous image and then grows into a huge mountain. There is a rock that has come and is growing into a mountain. The book of Daniel had become extremely important to Jews in Jesus' day. And Josephus points out the fact that this particular passage was used by Jews to validate their uprisings, their violent insurrections for empires, try to throw off the chains that were around them. But Jesus comes on the scene, and he collides with earth in a very different way, in an upside-down way. In John 16, as he's in the upper room preparing to go to the cross, he says to his disciples, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. I have conquered." We see then the next day, he is mocked. They give him a robe, they shove a crown of thorns in his hand, they beat him, and then give him a scepter. And then he's lifted up on a cross, and the placard above him, which is the charge for his crucifixion, is King of the Jews. The Jewish leaders wanted it to change to be, he claimed to be King of the Jews, and Pilate says, "I've written what I have written." And there on display we see that how Jesus conquered the world by being conquered. And what looked like the greatest defeat was the greatest victory of all time. As Paul says in Colossians 2:15, after God disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. God allows us to do in the crucifixion to Jesus what we do in small ways to each other all the time. We wake up grumpy, and people get cut to pieces with our words or our attitudes. And in human history, when kings were given enough power, we see literal life being just thrown away. And the consequences of sin and the human idolatry of power becomes a means by which they are conquered, because Jesus, after being killed on the cross, is vindicated through the resurrection, which we'll celebrate in a couple weeks together on Easter morning. So in Jesus, heaven and earth have already collided. The kingdom of heaven collides with all of our little tiny kingdoms on earth, and we are being transformed as God's people, citizens of that kingdom that will never end, to be a counter-cultural minority movement of love and service that doesn't play the games of power and doesn't fight on the battlefield or with the weapons that the world fights with. Because in Jesus, heaven has already smashed into earth, and all human kingdoms are temporary, but God's kingdom is eternal. And the next chapter, Daniel chapter 3, is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. Some of you may have first heard that story told to you by talking vegetables, like Veggie Tales. This isn't a kid's story. It's actually some of the things that you're never supposed to talk about in polite conversation. Like when you go get your hair cut or you're at a family dinner. Don't bring up politics and religion, but you find both of them here. We're going there in this chapter 3, as I overview the story and then set up Jesus in Daniel chapter 7. On the screen is a picture of two men. One of them, I'm sure you know, Adolf Hitler. And we know the horrors that came after his delusions for grandeur, his power, and his attempt to create the Übermensch, the Superman, one ethnic kind of superior race. Who you probably don't know is the guy standing next to Adolf Hitler there is a guy named Baldur von Schirach. He was kind of committed to the Nazi party at 18, and by his mid-20s, he was the architect of Hitler's Youth, which was a program that indoctrinated a generation to give in to the delusions and the horrors of Hitler. What you see now is a haunting closing quote in the London Times in an interview just before the war from Baldur. One cannot be a good German and at the same time deny God, but an arousal of faith in the eternal German is at the same time an arousal of faith in the eternal God. If we act as true Germans, we act according to the laws of God. Whoever serves Adolf Hitler, the Führer, serves Germany, and whoever serves Germany serves God. Here we have one of the clearest ever verbalized statements of the idolatry of national identity, which leads to her horrors in the world. That's what we have here in Nebuchadnezzar's statue that he sets up in chapter 3 of Daniel. He sets up a statue that's 90 feet high, and it's made of solid gold. If we remember Daniel chapter 2, the story here where the head was just gold, This is Nebuchadnezzar saying, my kingdom is going to last forever, and I want you to worship this kind of unholy trinity of government, of this empire, our national identity, my kind of power at the head of that government, and our religion kind of all mixed together. Worship me, worship Babylon, worship our gods all at once. So he sets up this statue, and he gathers, in verse 2, this long list, high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of this statue. That means this is a government thing from top to bottom. Even the dog catcher is there. Everybody who is in part of this government is going to kind of stamp this worship time. And so all the officials come, and he says, okay, in verse 4, people of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear this sound, and it goes through a lot of instruments here, horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bowed to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue. And anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace. And so they start the music, and everybody falls down in fear and worships this statue. Except 3 guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They quietly choose and peacefully to not participate in this idol worship. They're not going to bow down to the symbol, the national identity, the empire here. And what happens is they get pointed out and they're reported. Some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews, and they said, Nebuchadnezzar, this is verse 9, long live the king. You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down to the golden statue when the music played. The decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into the blazing furnace. But there are Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you've put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty, and they refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the golden statue set up. We see here in this kind of tattletale of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego how all these things conflate together. They're not going to worship you, your majesty, your gods, or the statues set up. And then verse 13, Nebuchadnezzar flew into rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. And when they were brought in, he said, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to worship my gods or to worship the golden statue I've set up? I'll give you one more chance. How gracious of you, Nebuchadnezzar, to bow down and worship the statue when you hear the sound of the music. But if you refuse, I will immediately throw you into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power? I love the response in verse 16 from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to King Nebuchadnezzar's threat here. They say, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. Wow, what confidence. They don't feel like that they're actually being threatened here. The most powerful man in the world is about to kill them, and they say we don't need to defend ourselves. If we are thrown into blazing furnace, the God whom we serve, capital G, in other words, you're not God, we serve someone who's above you, he is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power and your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the golden statue you've set up. Isn't that beautiful? We don't need to defend ourselves. God will rescue us. He's able. He will. But even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow down and worship. Nebuchadnezzar became so furious, he heats the furnace 7 times hotter. He throws them immediately in. So hot was this furnace that the guys who threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in were killed by the heat just by getting that close to the furnace. Then all of a sudden, Nebuchadnezzar jumps up in amazement, verse 24. Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace? Yes, your majesty, we certainly did, they replied. Look, Nebuchadnezzar shouted, I see 4 men unbound walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. And when they came out, all of the officials gathered around, and they saw that they didn't have a hair on their head singed, and their clothes, it was not scorched. They didn't even smell like smoke. Listen to Nebuchadnezzar's response in verse 28. Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree: if any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb to limb and destroyed. Their houses will be made into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this. So this seems like a conversion, maybe point for Nebuchadnezzar, and yet he still thinks he has the power to destroy people who will not kind of listen to his command to celebrate the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Here's three guys saying, "You aren't God." This is really a polite resistance. There's no, "You are a filthy, blaspheming blankety blank." No, I mean, you're not God. Nebuchadnezzar, when he's confronted with that fact, falls into a rage and throws them into the furnace. Their deliverance proves that fact. God did deliver them, not from the furnace, but through the fire. God was with them in the middle of that. There wasn't a public protest here. There wasn't, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't carrying signs that say God hates idols, right? They were just peaceful non-participants. They weren't even trying to draw attention to themselves. They weren't withdrawing and hiding away. They were fully engaging in that society, helping that kingdom in good ways to flourish. They were trying to serve Babylon, but not participate in national idolatry. And it was so powerful. We're called to resist national idolatry. We're supposed to engage fully in that upside-down kingdom. We're followers of Jesus first, not Americans first. We don't pledge allegiance first to a flag or a country, but to a king and a kingdom. We're called to dethrone our national identity and exalt the true image of God, who is Jesus. Listen how Paul says it in Colossians 1:15-20. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all these things have been created through him and for him. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Before we finish this morning with a Bible Project video about the theme, the Son of Man, in Daniel chapter 7, take a few minutes to meditate on these questions. What does our culture worship? Where are you being pressured to participate in that worship? And how can you resist with your friends as you follow Jesus together?
If you read the New Testament, you'll notice that the most common title people use to describe Jesus is the Christ. That is, the Messiah.
But surprisingly, Jesus almost never used that word to describe himself. Instead, he called himself the Son of Man.
The Son of Man. What does that mean?
Well, the phrase comes from an important chapter in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. Daniel was an Israelite prisoner of war who was forced to live in the empire of Babylon and work for the prideful, violent king who destroyed his home.
That sounds horrible.
And while he was living and working in Babylon, Daniel had this crazy prophetic dream. You ready for it?
I'm ready.
He saw 4 beasts crawling out of a dark sea, hybrid monster-like animals, each scarier than the one before. And the 4th beast is so mutant, there's nothing to compare it to. And it's violent, leaving death and destruction in its wake.
What in the world is this about?
Well, he's told that these beasts symbolize violent, prideful kings and their empires.
Oh, like the one Daniel's enslaved to.
Yeah, and these creatures might seem random to you, but these images are developing an important biblical theme. How humans are these remarkable creatures, capable of doing great good and horrible evil.
How we can behave like animals.
Right. Look at the first pages of the Bible. God creates the beasts of the field and humans together, all from the dust. But then the humans are set apart and given a royal task of being God's image.
So humans are like the animals, but called to become much more.
Yeah, they're to be God's representatives on earth, ruling on his behalf, like kings and queens. But keep reading, and the humans are deceived by a beast who says that they could be more than just God's partners.
Yeah, that they could rule the world on their own terms, which sounds good to them.
But God knows this will be a disaster, and so he expels the humans to the realm of the beasts.
The partnership is lost.
But God makes a promise that one day a human will be born who won't give in to the beast. Rather, he'll overcome and strike the beast while being struck by it.
Okay, so for the rest of the biblical story, we're waiting for that human. But instead, in story after story, we find people acting like beasts.
Yeah, like in the next story about Cain, who's jealous and angry at his brother Abel. God warns Cain that he's facing a beastly urge called sin, a dark, mysterious kind of evil that consumes humans. But God says that Cain can rule the beast if he chooses.
But he doesn't rule the beast. He lets this urge devour him, and he becomes a beast.
And then after this, Cain's children spread their animal-like violence, and it leads to the founding of a whole civilization known for its beastly pride, the city of Babylon.
Okay, Babylon. So fast forward, this is where Daniel is enslaved, having this bizarro dream.
Exactly. Now, watch what happens next in Daniel's dream. He sees into God's throne room where a court is set up, and God condemns the beast to destruction.
That's great.
And then Daniel sees that there's actually more than one divine throne.
Oh, right, the throne that humanity left behind.
Right. There hasn't been a human who's able to overcome the beast and rule alongside God until now. Daniel sees a figure called the Son of Man, which means a human. And he rides on a cloud up into God's presence and then sits down on the divine throne to rule the world.
The partnership's renewed.
Yes, and even more, all humanity worships and serves this Son of Man alongside God.
Oh, worship? So this is no ordinary human. This is like a God human.
Exactly. And so now you can see why Jesus of Nazareth, when he came onto the scene centuries later, chose this title, the Son of Man, for himself. He was claiming to be that truly human one on a mission to confront the beast.
He was tempted to seize power on the beast's terms.
But unlike every human before him, Jesus resisted the urge. And then he went about banishing the beast from people's lives, and he was teaching people how to rule the beast instead of being ruled by it.
Okay, so how do you rule the beast?
Well, Jesus did it by giving up his life.
Wait, rule the beast by dying?
Yes. When Jesus was on trial in a human courtroom and being condemned to death, he said, "From this moment on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at God's right hand and coming on the clouds."
But this is the moment he's about to die.
Exactly. From one perspective, the cross looks like a beastly torture device, but Jesus viewed it as his throne. And on this throne, he exposed the subhuman nature of our evil by letting it do its worst, and then he overcame it with his divine life and love. Jesus' execution was his exaltation.
So Jesus is the first human to overcome the beast, and as a result, he can partner with God to rule the world.
And so now, Jesus is summoning a new humanity into existence, one that can overcome the beast in the same paradoxical way.
To rule the beast by dying.
And then by discovering that Jesus' life and power can become our life and power. So we can rule the world as God's partners, but Jesus style, in the power of service, humility, and self-giving love.
Another way when the walls are closing in. When I look at the space between where I used to be and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. There was another in the fire, standing next to me. There was another in the water, back the seas. Should I ever need reminding how I've been set free? There is a cross that bears a bird, where another died for me. There is another in the fire. I'm no longer a slave to my sin anymore. Should I fall in the space between what remains of me and this reckoning? Either way, I will bow to the things of this world. I know I will never be alone. There was another in the fire, standing next to me. There is another in the waters, holding back the seas. Should I ever need reminding of what power set me free? There is a grave that holds nobody, now the power lives in me. There is another in the fire. Oh, there is another in the fire. Oh, and I can see the light in the darkness, as the darkness bows to him. I can hear the roar of the heavens, as the space between where we stand. I can feel the ground shake beneath us, as the prison walls cave in. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. There is no other name but the name that is Jesus. He who was and still is and will be through it all. So come one day in the space between all the things unseen and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. And I know I will never be alone. There is another in the fire. Oh, there's a lover in the fire. Oh.
The Son of Man who has authority over all nations and kingdoms, because he came and died and rose again. He's the one who commissions us, and it's his words we end with today. Let's quote the Great Commission together. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I'm with you always, to the very end of the age." Brothers and sisters, you are loved and you have been sent.
There is no other name but the name that is Jesus. He who was and still is and will be through it all. So come remain in the space between